Inside a concrete bunker in the Dutch woods, a woman on a raised platform aimed a beam of light at a map 12 meters wide. The dot she was tracking was a formation of American bombers already airborne over the North Sea. She could tell the men below where it was. She could not tell them where it was going. 350 miles west, under 10 feet of reinforced concrete outside High Wycombe, that question had already been answered the night before, on paper, and sent out along buried telephone cable to airfields across East Anglia. The Germans could hear the bombers warming up. They could hear the radio checks, the assembly chatter, the whole clumsy business of getting 1,000 aircraft into formation. They never heard the sentence that decided where those aircraft would go. Wire makes no sound. That silence cost the Luftwaffe the daylight sky. Start with what the Germans did know, because the myth here is that they were blind. They weren't. Assembling hundreds of bombers over England generated hours of radio traffic, and German listening posts picked it up. On most operational mornings, the Luftwaffe knew a raid was coming before the last group had finished forming up. What it never had was the decision. The detection network itself was, by any measure of 1943, extraordinary. Freya sets found formations far out over the sea. Würzburg dishes refined the plot. The readings flowed inward to plotting rooms, where an entire raid became a moving mark of light. It could give you altitude. It could give you heading. It could give you, within a few miles, the size of the force. It could not give you the target. A controller watching a track cross the Dutch coast was watching something that might still mean Bremen, Hanover, Kassel, or Berlin. He had to choose. And once he chose, he'd spent fuel that didn't come back. By 1944, the scarcest commodity in the Reich. The track was never a lie. It just was never an answer. On 15 September 1943, the Luftwaffe formed 1st Jagdkorps at Zeist in the occupied Netherlands under General Major Joseph Schmid, Beppo, to the men who'd known him in Goring's Circle. Its nerve center stood in the woods at Dielen, codenamed Diogenes, 40 meters by 60 meters, 16 meters high, with walls 3 to 4 meters thick, made of poured concrete. Around 600 people worked inside it. Walter Grabman took command of 3rd Jagd Division there in November 1943. Goring came to see the place and was given the tour. Everything about it was built to impress. It did. But every scramble it ordered committed real aircraft, real pilots, and irreplaceable aviation spirit against a guess. One bad guess didn't simply miss a raid. It emptied a division's tanks for the day. The building was perfect. The question it was built to answer was the wrong one. The man who had built Germany's electronic ears was Wolfgang Martini. He came up through signals in the First World War and pushed radar into the Luftwaffe, while senior officers still regarded it as a distraction. From 1941 until May 1945, he held the post of General der Luftnachrichtentruppe. The entire listening, tracking, and fighter control apparatus of the German Air Force ran through him. For 4 of the earlier years, Martini's reports on British radar had landed on one particular desk. From January 1938 to November 1942, Luftwaffe intelligence was run by Joseph Schmid. Schmid was not a fool, and it's worth being careful here. His department was underfunded and structurally isolated, competing with rival German signals organizations that barely spoke to each other. That was the machine he inherited, not the machine he designed. But the record is what it is. Martini's warnings about British radar were consistently discounted, and the officer discounting them was Schmid. In September 1943, Schmid took command of the fighter corps defending the Reich. He had once been free to ignore the signal. Now he had nothing else. The Americans worked all of this out, and their answer was not to defeat the radar. The radar was fine. Their answer was to attack the moment of decision. A bomber force flying a straight line from England to its target was a gift. The track drew the conclusion for you. So the 8th stopped flying straight lines. Formations crossed the coast on one heading and turned onto another. Wings split and rejoined. Diversionary forces ran towards one region while the main body went somewhere else entirely. Every dogleg on a flight plan existed for one purpose: to make a German controller commit early or commit wrong. The Germans understood exactly what was being done to them. That's the part usually left out. Their counter was direct and, in its way, ingenious. By late 1943, each fighter division was operating Führungshalter aircraft, shadowers, usually Ju-88Cs, whose entire job was to fly alongside an American formation and radio back its course, altitude, and direction, minute by minute. The most advanced air defense system on Earth had been reduced to sending an aeroplane to follow the enemy and describe him out loud. It worked. It also confirmed the problem. A shadower reports where a formation is. It cannot report a sentence typed into a field order the previous night. The cost of guessing was measured in gauges. A Gruppe that launched on the wrong azimuth climbed to 25,000 feet and found empty sky came home with perhaps 20 minutes of usable fuel. They landed. They refueled. And sometimes, sitting on the taxi strip with the engine still ticking as they cooled, the pilots watched the bomber stream pass overhead, the raid they'd been scrambled to stop crossing above them while they waited on a Bowser. Ground crews learned to read a returning Gruppe by the fuel it hadn't burned in combat. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the argument inside the room, rather than the numbers stamped on the airframe, a like and a subscribe, genuinely helps. The part of this the Germans never worked out is still ahead. It wasn't in the sky at all. On the night of the 3rd of March, 1944, a teletype at Horham in Suffolk printed Field Order 477 for the 95th Bomb Group. Maximum forces against objectives in the Berlin area, 4th of March. It arrived by cable. It made no sound anyone could intercept. What happened the next morning is among the strangest episodes of the campaign. A recall was heard over the radio. Almost every aircraft in the division turned back. One combat wing didn't. 19 B-17 bombers from the 95th, 12 from the 100th, and a single Pathfinder from the 482nd flew on to Berlin because their crews had decided the recall was a German ploy. It hadn't come through correctly. They were guessing about a sentence. So were the Germans. 2 days later, the 8th went back. On the 6th of March, it lost 69 B-17 bombers in a single day, the heaviest loss it ever suffered. The Luftwaffe lost 160 aircraft doing it. Both sides were now guessing about the same sentence. None of this should suggest the German system was ineffective. Through most of 1943, it was murderous. And murderous precisely because the American plan kept holding still long enough to be read. On the 17th of August, 1943, the 8th attempted its most ambitious operation to that point. Two forces, Regensburg and Schweinfurt, launched close together so the defending fighters would have to divide. It was a sound plan. English weather broke it. Cloud over the bases delayed the second force by roughly 90 minutes, long enough for the fighters that had fought the first wave to land, rearm, refuel, and go up again. 60 bombers didn't come back. 557 men were listed missing or taken prisoner. 2 months later, the 8th returned to Schweinfurt. The loss figures for the 14th of October are still disputed depending on the counting method. 60 failed to return. 77 written off, but the meaning isn't disputed by anyone. Unescorted daylight bombing against an intact German control network was not survivable. The system worked. It worked whenever the plan didn't change. That was the condition nobody at Deelen or Zeist had ever written down, because nobody had needed to. The turn came in 4 stages, and they can be named. The first was tactical. In January 1944, James Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force and rewrote what escort fighters were for. Until then, they'd flown tight to the bombers, defending. Doolittle's instruction was blunt. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. The escorts were released to hunt. It meant more bombers exposed on any given day, and Doolittle knew it when he signed it. It also meant German fighters were now dying on the way to an interception instead of at it. The second stage was intelligence, and this is where the story turns quietly. Bletchley Park had been reading the Luftwaffe's Enigma key since the 22nd of May, 1940. By 1944, the product, Ultra, reached Allied commanders through a channel so tightly restricted that ordinary 8th Air Force intelligence officers didn't know it existed. Routes, timings, and diversions were being shaped by German signals the Germans believed were secure. They investigated. That's what makes it remarkable. German internal reviews examined the possibility of compromise more than once, and more than once certified their ciphers safe. There is no memo where they got it right. That absence is the document. The third stage was electronic, and by late 1944 it had become almost theatrical. Assembly over East Anglia, those hours of VHF chatter while hundreds of bombers found each other, had always been Germany's free warning. In November 1944, the 36th Bomb Squadron was handed the job of screening it. Jamming was tested on November 18th and flown daily from the 25th. Then, on November 28th, with no mission scheduled at all, the screen went up anyway. Behind it flew 3 more B-24 aircraft carrying extra radio operators reading from a script, performing an assembly that wasn't happening for an enemy with no way to check. The German network wasn't obsolete. It wasn't even inaccurate. By the end of 1944, it was simply no longer connected to anything that decided the outcome. The fourth stage was attritional, and it finished the argument. By Adolf Gallen's own reckoning, the German fighter force lost something like 1,000 aircraft between December 1943 and March 1944. Aircraft could be replaced. The pilots could not. There is a paper trail on the German side, and it belongs to the man least likely to have left one. On December 11, 1943, Joseph Schmid formally requested that everything feeding the air defense, radio intercept, radar, and ground observers, be placed under a single agency. On January 24, 1944, he put the case to the Air Ministry again. He complained after the war that nothing was done until March 31, 1944. Set that against what was actually happening, and it becomes almost unbearable to read. Schmid was fighting, correctly and stubbornly, to centralize the answer to where are they now? The Americans had already stopped depending on that question. They were reading his own side's mail. He was right about the fragmentation. He was right about the delay. He was right about a system that no longer decided anything. And the engineers weren't careless either. The machine they trusted was, on paper, close to unbreakable. And the industrial effort required to break it was on a scale nobody in Berlin imagined an enemy would spend mid-war. They checked. They kept checking. They checked the wrong thing and had no way of knowing it. Martini's ending is stranger and more human. Before the collapse, engineers at Gemma sealed key radar documents in a waterproof metal casket and buried them. In the early 1950s, Martini went and recovered the casket out of the Soviet zone. In 1951, he helped found a radio location committee in Düsseldorf, the body that became the German Society for Positioning and Navigation, and those buried papers were read out at its meetings and released into open technical literature. He became a friend of Robert Watson Watt, the man usually called the father of British radar. He was still the Society's executive director when he died in Düsseldorf on the 6th of January, 1963. The organization he started still runs today, out of Bonn, holding conferences on air, sea, and satellite navigation. He had spent a war building a system to find aircraft in order to destroy them, and spent his last years handing that knowledge to a profession whose entire purpose is to help aircraft find each other and not collide. The unit that faked a raid on the 28th of November 1944 outlived him. The 36th Bomb Squadron is today the 36th Electronic Warfare Squadron at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Same lineage, same idea, attack what the enemy believes, not what he can see. And Diogenes is still standing in the woods at Scharsbergen, too solid to demolish, too large to ignore. It was eventually given the only job a building like that can still do. For years, it served the Dutch National Archives as an auxiliary depot. Visitors can get inside roughly once a month, down the concrete stairs, past the ventilation shaft and the old emergency generator. The room that once tracked 1,000 aircraft in real time now holds paper that doesn't move at all. That's the part worth arguing over, and I'd like to hear where you land. Whether Schmid's system was badly run, or whether it was built with enormous care and expense to answer a question that had already stopped mattering. Leave a comment. And if this was worth your time, a like and a subscribe keeps the research going. because the trade-off hasn't gone anywhere. Radar today will tell you where an aircraft is to within a meter. It still can't tell you what that aircraft has been ordered to do. The instruction travels somewhere else, down a cable through a network, in silence. There is still a concrete room in the Dutch woods where a woman once aimed a beam of light at a map 12 meters wide and knew everything about the bombers except where they were going.